St- Okay, sorry. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, depending where you are. Here we are in another webinar of the FMG. Our CEO, Lu Xiaopeng, is late. He should be doing this introduction, but probably he will be with us in a couple of minutes. This session, it's about the WTO reform, which is very opportune, having in mind what's going on in Geneva. As far as I understand, the chair of the General Council is having consultations on the major issues of the WTO reform, decision making, MFN, plurilaterals, S&D, and so on. So this is very timely, this discussion. And for that, we will have as a moderator, Bernard Högman. Most of you know very well him. He's nowadays Director of Global Economics at the Schumann Center in the European University in Italy. Before that, he used to work in the World Bank as a director as well. The Secretariat, GATT Secretariat, a number of years ago. So, and he will be the moderator of the discussion. Bernard, you have the floor.
Great.
Sorry,
Thank you.
let me, I forgot to mention that this webinar will be recorded. That's it. Go ahead.
Okay, no worries. Okay, so thanks everyone for being here. The background to this webinar is essentially an email exchange that took place, I don't know, must be 2, 3 weeks ago now, which was on safeguards, right? And essentially thinking about what is the role of safeguards in the trading system now. And the trigger for that was the recent discussion and the kind of vitalization of discussion about global imbalances. And our speaker today, Sébastien Jean, who is a professor of economics at the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers in Paris, and has been or was for a long time the head of CEPI, the kind of think tank in Paris, which focuses on international economics issues. So Sébastien contributed to a report that was issued by CEPR, Sciences Po, Bruegel, basically a bunch of institutions on global imbalances. And I thought that was a very interesting chapter that he wrote for that book. But essentially, the background to that book is what I said a few minutes ago, is that there's now a renewed focus on global imbalances, what should be done about them. And of course, very much front and center in that debate is the United States in terms of its huge fiscal deficit, in terms of its continuous situation of savings being a lot less than investment, and that being reflected in current account deficits as well as fiscal deficits. And then, of course, we have China, which has been very much increasing its current account surpluses, its trade, its exports of goods to the world. And in the middle, we have the European Union, and Sebastian is from the EU, French, as am I from the Netherlands. The EU is kind of sitting there in the middle, having to deal with both the repercussions of these global imbalances, but also a contributor to those global imbalances. The EU was also running a pretty significant, well, it depends on whether we're looking at goods or at services, but also has a surplus. So I'm not going to say a lot more about this, but I think, again, just to link it back to trade, one of the things Sebastian does in his chapter, and he'll speak to this, is not just talk about this as a macro problem, and clearly it is primarily a macro problem, but the real question, I think, for all of us on this call who are more focused on the trade side is it sufficient in a counterfactual world? If that macro problem could be resolved, would that be sufficient to also address the trade tensions that we're seeing increasingly prominent today? So, Sebastian, that's my introduction to you. Why don't you take it from here? And then we usually have discussions. We don't have discussions today, but there's enough people on the call who have been thinking about these issues for a long time that I'm sure we're going to have an active debate. So over to you.
Thanks a lot, Bernard. Thanks a lot for your introduction, and thank you for having me. It's really a treat and an honor to be speaking today. I'm sharing my screen. I hope everybody can see it clearly, but please let me know in case of any issue. So the motivation for this work, this contribution to the Paris report is actually pretty simple. It's motivated by a frustration somehow, or what I see as a paradox, which is the following. We are all witnessing all these political tensions surrounding trade surpluses in particular right now. And at the same time, the fact is that for decades, economic and financial debates have been focusing on current account deficits. So not trade, but current account, financial side somehow, or this deficit sustainable? That has been the main motivation for this debate and this economic literature. Not so much surpluses as deficit countries being the source of concern. And so somehow there is a misfit here between political concerns and economic debates. And my question is simple somehow. Is that right? Shouldn't we somehow shift the focus of the economic analysis, or at least adapt it? And what are the policy implications? So my starting point is not to argue with this economic and literature about the sustainability of current accounts and current account deficits, which I think is fair, is really informative, really good. My question is whether is that right that we are considering that trade surpluses per se are not an issue worth taking into account per se? Is that only a fungible part of current account? And so I started asking myself, why is it that even large trade surpluses are often disregarded? And I think there are four main reasons for that. The first one is that we used to think that this is innocuous, in the sense that sustaining a large trade surplus for a country is not a good strategy, because it's a way to, you're producing more than you consume, or if you want, you're not consuming all that you produce, which somehow can be interpreted as meaning that you are transferring to partner countries a purchasing power. Okay, and in many textbook models, this is detrimental. Actually, according to Keynes, in this famous controversy with Bertil Ohlin about the transfer problem 1 century ago, Keynes argued that it was a double burden on the country transferring the purchasing power because of the impact on terms of trade. Okay, so if it's not a good strategy, so why worry? I mean, it will be abandoned soon. Second, it is temporary. It is sought to be temporary by nature because there are adjustment mechanisms, and especially linked to exchange rate adaptation. Third, they can be in many cases natural because a lot of market mechanism might explain these trade surpluses linked to the business cycle, in particular the cycle in the housing sector, which might have large consequences, because also some countries might have comparative advantages in goods as opposed to services, and so on. So all that can be really explanation rooted in market mechanisms. And finally, trade in good is sought to be a fungible part of the current account, and there's assuming that there is nothing special about goods, and actually nothing special even about manufactured goods. So, as you suspect at that time, I thought twice about this argument, and I found that each of them is really fragile, and that after all, large trade surpluses might be a concern per se. Why? First, because they turn out not to be so innocuous. And I think it's pretty clear by now that sustaining a large trade surplus may, in some cases, I'm not saying it's always the case. I'm not saying it's easy, but it might be a good strategy if what you have in mind is improving your productivity, your innovation, if your priority is not necessarily in immediate purchasing power for consumer, but in technology, in the technology competition. Symmetrically, and this is especially the case if we're living in a world where Marshallian externalities, local level externalities are strong. And I think this is the case right now. Symmetrically, if this is a good strategy, then it's also the case that for trade deficit countries, it might be a problem facing this trade deficit might be a problem because it actually reduces the scale offered of the market for their producers. These surpluses are not necessarily so temporary either, because they are not when adjustment mechanisms are blocked and or neutralized, especially as regard exchange rate. They are not necessarily natural either, when they result from deliberate policy choices. And finally, and importantly, right now, I guess, there is a question of geopolitical sensitivity, and we know that from this specific perspective, manufacturing is different. And I think there's no need to emphasize that given all the events we've been witnessing over the last few years, in particular export controls over specific categories of goods, high-tech goods or critical minerals, this is pretty important. I think at the end of the day, Olivier Blanchard and Gian-Maria Milesi Ferretti in a paper 2012 nailed it pretty well when they wrote that the quote I'm reproducing here, that proving intent, the fact that surpluses reflect a deliberate strategy designed to gain comparative advantage, is likely to be difficult. But at the same time, ignoring intent may be politically unacceptable. And that's, I think, pretty true still today. So let's have a look at trade surpluses at the world level. And so this famous usual graph, IMF graph of current account imbalances, I'm here plotting it for trade surpluses, not current account imbalances, or sorry, trade imbalances. And when you do that, that's all based on customs duty, customs data. What you see is that right now, in recent years, in the right-hand side of this graph, in the room of trade imbalances, somehow there are just two main elephants. One in negative, in blue, the US, and one in positive, in red, China. They are really dominant in that picture. And as I argued just before that, the source of political concerns and political tensions is trade surpluses. This leads me to focus on China, obviously. So let's have a look specifically on China. The Chinese trade surplus here is measured as the share of the imports of all other countries in the world. It's done for all products in blue and for red products manufactured products in red. Okay, question of sources in blue as well, because probably most of you have heard about all these concerns about the measurement of the Chinese surplus. The fact, I think it's what is really striking here is the Chinese position for manufactured products. China's surplus is now worth more than 15% of the sum of all imports in the world from all other countries, which is huge and which is unparalleled for decades, certainly at least from since the 60s. And so this is, of course, a big question. Now, given having made that observation, I mean, I think I'm coming back to the question of intent. I was emphasizing before, intent and causality. Is that surplus market-driven, or is it, so to say, man-made? And I think here there are two questions. One has to do with the level of this surplus, the macroeconomic question. And another one has to do with distribution. And it's also in itself an important question, of course, by WTO rules and agreement. We all know that it's also important, especially at a time, by the way, where all countries, all advanced economies have the same priorities. We all want to be very good in high tech, in what we see as in green tech, in supercomputers, etc. So let's have a look at it. First, macroeconomically. Macroeconomically, there's been discussion about the rebalancing of the Chinese economy for more than 20 years now. The famous paper by Blanchard and Javadi was published more than 20 years ago. What am I seeing? Well, if I just focus on a simple statistic, the share of final consumption in GDP, well, it's pretty much where it was 20 years ago. Almost 57% now, 55% in 2005. So, I mean, it declined and it increased, okay, but I mean, in 20 years, I don't think there is really meaningful adjustment here. Another quite telling figure, I think, is observing the fact that against the background I just described of a surging trade surplus, China's real effective exchange rate depreciated by 15% over the last 4 years, which is contrary to any meaningful model, at least at this scale. If your market mechanism are supposed to lead in that case to an appreciation, not a depreciation. An intermediate level between purely macroeconomic and purely sectoral is what I call the pro-manufacturing bias. And I think this is an important characteristic of Chinese policies, the fact that there is a tendency to favor the manufacturing sector considered as something more important than the rest somehow. This led to, as a matter of fact, lending to the manufacturing sector growing constantly at a level, at a rate, a yearly growth rate larger than 30% between the fall of 2020 and the end of 2023, for instance. It's also reflected in policy planning. Here I'm quoting the 14th five-year plan, which explicitly set the goal of to enhance the competitive advantage of the manufacturing sector. It's also pretty clear in the leadership speeches, and here I'm quoting Xi Jinping in a few short quotes. The need, he was calling to focus on the real economy, to boost China's strengths in manufacturing, and in contrast, denouncing what he called, apparently it was not a direct quotation, something it's been quoted by journalists, what he called the trap of welfareism that encourages laziness, which makes clear that there is a reluctance to develop further social protection. And we all know that this is a large, an important part of the story about the rebalancing of the economy. Now, what about the sector level? Well, at the sector level, it's pretty clear that Chinese industrial policies are very strong and that they are actually completely overwhelming compared to what is practiced by other countries. The IMF, in a recent work, assessed that they were worth at least 4.4% of GDP as of 2023. The OECD reckons that firms in China receive 3 to 8 times more government support than their OECD counterparts. So I think there is plenty of evidence showing that there are very strong and successful, by the way, and it's really a big success. I mean, in many respects, at least, even though the price effectiveness is difficult to assess, but it's been very influential, those Chinese policies. Now, the question for the partners, of course, is that prejudicial to them? is it influential, in particular, in the sectoral distribution of trade surpluses? Because Chinese trade surpluses must be the trade deficit of others. Here, I'm quoting the recent IMF paper by Pierre-Olivier Gourin-Chasse and co-authors, saying empirically we lack evidence on the impact of industrial policies and subsidies on external balances. Actually, it was written after my paper, but I think it presents well the kind of questions presently in the debate. That's the reason why I then focused on this empirical question. Are sector-level trade surpluses linked in practice to those industrial policies? I'm not pretending I have a definitive answer to that, but I tried to gather a suggestive evidence about that question. To do that, I used the data from Global Trade Alert, their count of interventions, in particular domestic subsidies, by HS4 heading. Importantly, I'm doing that to compare interventions across various sectors within the same economy, not across economies. I don't think this can be thought of as a reliable way to compare practices across economies, because the ways the practices differ so much from one country to another. So I use that, and then I began asking a simple question. If I group products in three baskets, depending on the intensity of policy intervention, okay, products where you have strong intervention, middle or low, does it make a difference? Okay, because the surge I was referring to has been spectacular from 2019 onwards. I took that as a reference, as a point of reference. And the result is the following. Here you have changes in the in Chinese net exports, so the surplus by group of products, okay, rebased zero for the fourth quarter of 2019. And I observed the trend after, as of 2020, between products with a low level of intervention in blue, a middle level of intervention in red, or a high level of intervention in green. I think the graph is quite telling, in the sense that there is a stark contrast between those three groups of products. This is done for all products on the left, for manufactured products only on the right. And in both cases, the contrast, I think, is quite telling. And it's quite suggestive of these industrial policies, as a matter of fact, having a concrete, practical impact on net exports. Then the question then, well, an interpretation might be that, of course, to some extent, it's natural. You're carrying out policies, it has an impact. So perhaps it's the case for any country, actually. So I did the same analysis for the EU and the US, and here you see the result. And what you see is nothing, actually. Nothing happens there. There's no clear contrast across these groups by level of intervention. So it's really a China-specific feature. Of course, this is only suggestive. So then I turn to econometrics. I don't think it's the right place to enter the details, but to put it simply, I made simple econometrics, assuming that you need to that policies take time to have an impact. So you need not work with year-to-year impacts, but rather work with assuming that it takes 3 years, for instance, to have an impact. And then I carried out differences analysis, an econometric analysis, separately for exports and for imports. Long story short, and I can go into details if you want in the discussion, the conclusion is below in that slide. And it's the following. After 3 years, I find that for China, exports are 7 to 9% higher for products in which there is intensive policy intervention compared to products with no intervention. okay, 7 to 9%, which is, I think, some quite significant impact. Then I did the same for imports. Okay, I had to treat them separately, export and imports, because it does not make sense economically to treat directly net exports. And here, imports doing the same thing, basically. I conclude that I find that imports are actually, the impact is even larger, and that for those products with very intensive policy intervention, compared to products with no intervention, imports are 9 to 18% lower. When you try to understand that, you of course you might wonder where, if this is the case, probably we could see it as well in prices, and even though it's unclear to what extent there might be an effect on quality or non-price characteristics of the product, but still it's interesting to investigate prices. So very shortly, I did the same for prices. It's not the same temporality, not the same data. Let me not enter the details. What I find is, I mean, it's less clear, but still it's that for products with high intervention, policy intervention, prices tended to decline. And econometrically as well, it's here, export prices tended to trend down for those products where policy intervention is larger. So what is the conclusion? What is my conclusion, at least? First, I think trade surpluses are really, it's completely understandable, completely logical that they are a subject of tension and of concern and of attention per se. And in that respect, we are now in a situation which is primarily marked by the huge and increasing China's surpluses, especially for manufactured product. It's a question, and I think there is quite telling evidence that these surpluses are the result of policy choices, both in terms of level and in terms of distribution. Given this result, first, and don't get me wrong, my first thought in terms of policy implication is that confrontational policies are not the right response to this situation. Actually, they even have demonstrably failed in the US case, and Donald Trump showed us that in two occasions, or in multiple occasions, actually. But at the same time, I want to emphasize that I think ignoring this fact, ignoring these tensions, is not politically sustainable. And to put it bluntly, I think we are on a collision course. So if we are friends of multilateralism, we must face this fact that there is a big tension at the core of international exchanges right now, and we need to deal with it. So, of course, the US and the EU are also part of these imbalances, and they should do their homework. And that's really important, and that's an important part of the response to the present situation. By the way, it's also useful, I think, to update our references somehow and realize that, speaking of the EU, the trade surplus now of the EU in 2025 is basically zero. If you exclude Ireland, completely distorted because of US MFN tax optimization practices, I think the EU trade surplus in 2025 was 13 billion euros. Okay, which is completely marginal at this scale. So I conclude that we need to some correction, and China in particular need to correct course. And that's not only China; it's also there are also very large and surging surpluses by smaller countries, but that's which also should be dealt with. I'm thinking in particular about Taiwan and South Korea, for instance. But of course, because of its size, China is the main issue for international discussions. And more broadly, I think it also raises the questions of rules and norms in the multilateral arena, and of the necessity to tie closer macro and exchange rate surveillance to trade disciplines. I saw that Petros Mavroidis was here. I really like referring to his work and analysis on the liberal understanding of trade disciplines, and I think that's really something that should be on the agenda. Thinking about how we cope with a world where there is no really shared liberal understanding, I guess, and what are the implications for trade rules. Thanks. I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention, and looking forward for the discussion.
Thanks, Sebastian. I think that's very informative, and I'm sure it gives people a lot of things to think about and to respond to. So I think one of the things that you get to, and I think it's something we've been discussing in the group for a while, on and off, is how much of the problem would be resolved if you actually get the macro situation right, if everybody does their homework right. Because in a sense, what you seem to be arguing in your last slide is, let's assume heroically that suddenly the macro is fixed in terms of the drivers of these large current account deficits in the US, and the EU starts investing more of its own capital, etc. What you're saying in the slide is that doesn't seem to be enough, right? So that would also mean, so I guess that's a question to you. Do you think that would resolve most of these problems, or do we really need to attack directly these sectoral policies that in your analysis are really driving some of these trade surpluses, which presumably could get addressed if we have significant exchange rate adjustments, etc. But I think that is kind of a question. Would they be, or is it a broader problem that really calls for other instruments?
I see those two dimensions as two closely related dimensions, calling for related replies. So I think the macroeconomic, solving the macroeconomic dimension is important and would be an important part of the solution. Not that it is easy, not I believe that there is a close prospect of any of the big players somehow significantly changing its course just for the sake of rebalancing. But I think that would be already a big part of what needs to be done. At the same time, we would remain with the initial motivation of the WTO or GATT disciplines on subsidies, which is avoiding subsidy competition of distortions linked to subsidies in particular for strategic products. And it's pretty clear that right now everybody wants to have a strong producing sector in green techs, in electronics, semiconductors, etc. So you have a collision of subsidies for those sectors, but that I think that it would be far easier to deal with that if we had not, in addition, these macroeconomic imbalances. That's perhaps the best I can do to frame the articulation somehow.
Great. Well, we have quite a few people on the call, so why don't I just open the floor and people can jump in as they wish. I'll just take them in order that they come in. So John, why don't you go first?
Yeah, thanks very much, John Clark, a member of the FMG. Very interesting presentation, Sebastian. Thank you so much. They're really interesting, and the numbers and figures were extremely valuable to us all, I think. China has signalled that it's willing to discuss its industrial policy and its subsidy schemes in the WTO. I think that is a tactic to gain time, frankly. And I think all of us who have been involved in WTO for the last few decades don't believe that it will be possible to have any serious negotiation on industrial policy or modernization of the subsidy agreement anytime soon. So that leaves countries or the EU, for example, with the choice: does it pursue the multilateral route and try and which I think is futile, frankly, negotiating stronger subsidies, disciplines that would dampen this Chinese exuberance, or should the EU simply go in the direction of the US and others in imposing on Chinese imports a swinging, prohibitive tariff, probably illegal under WTO, to basically stop the imports of Chinese electric vehicles and green tech and all the other things that are damaging European industry. If the EU to that, would that solve the problem? Would that solve the problem of this Chinese overcapacity, massive trade surplus, undermining of European jobs? A blunt instrument, basically blocking Chinese imports.
Good, clear question.
Yeah. Short reply: no. I'm against a blunt tariffs on China to deal with that issue. I think that's a very bad way to. It's a good way to make things worse, so to say. At the same time, I agree with you that there is a lot of frustration about the capacity of rules to rein in subsidies and impact. My opinion is that the way to go is to use instruments available, tools available more strategically, meaning in that case, use more strongly trade defense instruments or autonomous tools in the extended to extend it to a larger set of instruments in European parlance, and that already, I mean, that's not a silver bullet either. It won't save everything, but that I think an appropriate response because it is principled and because it's also linked to the macroeconomic dimension in the sense that I think it's a way to build leverage because I mean the sad truth is that we are really in a situation where it's bargaining and somehow arm twisting the situation, this dialogue, when you see all this export control or rare earth, for instance, and US policies, of course, and the EU is trying to do its side, on its side as well. So I think we need to build leverage as well to kind of contribute to the balance. And so that's my preference is to do that. And in addition, that possibly a practicable way in the EU to agree upon a more flexible use of TDI. Yeah.
But Sebastian, doesn't that kind of boil down to the same thing at the end? So yes, there'll be a process, there'll be investigation. So again, it's obviously better in that sense, but the end instrument is still going
I see two important differences. One, it's principled. I mean, even though you can argue that you are stretching the principles, there are principles. I mean, so it's consistent with a rules-based discussion. Okay, first. Secondly, it paves the way for a targeted approach. For Europe, I don't think Chinese competition in solar panels is a problem anymore. It is an opportunity. Okay, so I mean, using in a targeted, well-targeted manner this kind of instrument is also a way to make this differentiation possible. And I think this is also a way to make the discussion. I mean, to avoid making the worst unavoidable. Somehow, I'm not claiming it will make the discussion easy, but that's already a contribution that not having an indiscriminate approach.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I think it points to the instruments we have in the WTO, which don't really think about what are the positive externalities associated with some of these subsidies in particular sectors, for example, if we want to fight climate change. So that might get us back into the WTO reform agenda. Petros.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a very, very illuminating discussion. I have three short questions. May I ask all three, or should you want me to ask less?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. First is, do you think, Sebastian, do you think we should accept big part of the blame, we, the Western nations, the incumbents of the WTO, since we negotiated the WTO framework without China, at the same time as the China accession, and still now we say the WTO, which China did not negotiate, is not good enough to deal with China. I mean, this is to me, I don't know, somebody should stand up and say, I did something wrong here. That's point two, assuming it's wrong.
Yeah.
That's point one. Point two is I see, and I'm getting a little bit more and more worried actually, I see the Trump second administration is picking up from where it left the first time. This board of trade they did with China is again all about managed trade. Buy X, I will sell you Y, and then X and Y are more or less equivalent sums, so we're fine. And unfortunately, the European Union is not taking any distance from those things. I mean, to a large extent, emulating the US policies. And I wonder, I mean, have they learned no lessons from managed trade so far, where it leads? And my third and last point is probably much, much more up your alley, is when there were issues with Japan in the 80s, I was in kindergarten, I was reading Bernard Hoekman's paper, who's much older than me. I remember that what they did is they tried trade solutions, none of them worked. The semiconductor agreement was a disaster. So what they did was the Plaza Accords, where they essentially renegotiated macroeconomic instruments. What they did is, okay, let's see what is the current exchange rates that we had before and what it should be from now on. Why don't I hear any discussion about something similar now instead of everything that they see the hullabaloo on trade?
Very good questions. Well, on the blame, I mean, and WTO, China's WTO accession. My benchmark, somehow, my reference point is your book with André, and I remember you conclude more or less saying the mystery then is why didn't members impose a liberal understanding when accepting China? And to me, that's really that's also my conclusion. So my analysis is that the negotiation was extremely tough. It could not have been tougher, actually, but the target was wrong, in the sense that there was this assumption that China was converging and that we could think that we were negotiating rules by economies sharing the same liberal system. And the reality is that indeed that has been the case for the GATT for most of its life, except peripheral countries, as you show in your book, by the way. But it's not the case anymore. So I think that deeply the problem now is that we are working with rules built on the assumption that countries share the same liberal understanding of the same economic system, and we are applying that to a situation where they are not applying the same system, which and I'll come back to the second question, but which makes a direct link with your third question. Is it possible to find a trade-based solution to these tensions and these imbalances? And that's the reason why the last line of my conclusion was perhaps we should think of linking closer together trade and macroeconomic surveillance. And I think, well, to me, part of the paradox or the weird aspect of the present situation is that there has been no substantial discussion about exchange rates over the last 4 years, given the situation I just described. it's strange that it takes 4 years to realize that we are facing a trend in exchange rate, which I think is conducive to just larger imbalances. And of course, well, there are a lot of explanations, but I think that's a big part of the issue. Indeed, I'm not sure a Palazzo agreement can be replicated, but I do think that the macroeconomic dimension must be tied to the trade dimension if we want to move ahead and find a bargaining that would be acceptable by all main players. Now, why isn't Europe reacting more to this trend toward managed trade? I think Europe is really paralyzed by, in particular, the US position. And it was obvious last year in this negotiation to the Turnberry Agreement. I really dislike the Turnberry Agreement for many reasons. Its inconsistency with WTO rules is one of them. Another one is that I think through this agreement, Europe completely refused somehow building a bargaining position against the US and saying, okay, because we are dependent on you for security, we must accept everything. And I think that's a mistake, and that's the reason why it's a never-ending story, and Trump is always finding other reasons to quarrel with Europe from a trade point of view, because it seems understandably to believe that that comes for free for the US, that you can have the dispute you want with the EU and there is no reaction, never. Yeah, because that's deeply disturbing. It was already deeply disturbing in the phase one deal. Well, I agree.
Okay, thanks. Alejandro.
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you, Sebastian. As was said, well, this has been very illuminating. I apologize coming in late. I think I came a couple of slides late, so what I'm going to say, maybe you touched upon in the earlier part of your intervention, your presentation. And two things. One, the little economics I know, and Patrick Lowe would say that is very little, taught me over the years that, I mean, the subsidy of one party maybe translates itself into consumer welfare from the other parties. But I've seen in this discussion, not only on your presentation, nothing about the effects of consumer welfare. And when some of the remedies are espoused, such as, for example, trade defense measure or others, this consideration doesn't come up, which presumably would call for the use of temporary instruments while our economies adjust to new levels of competition from China because it subsidizes X, Y, and Z. But over time, we have to adjust to see a more efficient way of using our resources, and it will be of net consumer welfare in the long run. This is, of course, politically difficult, but if one does the job gradually, maybe it could also work or help in terms of adjustment. My second point is about following up on what Petros said, and you replied. And when you talk about macro and exchange rate surveillance, I see the rationale for that, but I don't think that will ever happen in the WTO. No self-respecting minister of finance will ever allow a trade minister to even think about such things. So there needs to be a closer coordination, not only between WTO and IMF, but between the finance and the trade ministries around the world. And that of itself is highly difficult. But I can see the point that perhaps more should be done in the medium and in terms of what the IMF should be doing in terms of exercising its responsibilities, in terms of exchange rate surveillance. I'm not too familiar with the IMF, but I would welcome your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, important questions. About consumer welfare, I think that's really at the root of differences in interpretation. The fact that by textbook economic models, an export subsidy and an export surplus are bad for consumer welfare. But then what I'm seeing is that this is just a proof of the disconnect between economic textbook and the present situation. For two main reasons, basically, I think. The first one is that this is a purely static analysis. If you have in mind a dynamic setup with local externalities in addition, then you can reap significant economic benefit from a trade surplus, okay, because you increase the scale of your production. I mean, it dates back to the Graham argument for protection, if you like. That was static in that case, but linked to the economies of scale. The second point is that are we really, is really consumer welfare the objective? It's pretty clear to me that in the case of China, it's not. It's pretty clear that part of the problem we are facing now is due to the fact that technological competition is front and center in those international relationships. So we don't understand anything if we stick to consumer welfare. It's of course in the EU or in the US it's far more important. But so there is a disconnect here, perhaps between the objective function across countries and between the reality and the theoretical analysis. Now about exchange rates. Of course, it's always been a very difficult issue because of the need to coordinate with macroeconomic surveillance in the IMF. But let me try to phrase it simply that way. What is really the interest and the sense of strict, tight disciplines over trade relationships, tariff, etc., if macroeconomic policies are left completely unchecked? I think it's difficult to not to conclude that it's really having the wrong focus if we are in a situation like this one. Okay, I was arguing that it's not exactly the same story of level versus distribution, true, but at the end of the day, in order to make sense, and that's why I was referring to the story of the liberal understanding as well, because that's also connected in the sense that from a macroeconomic point of view, liberal approach would rely upon the assumption that market mechanisms are going to work and to pave the way for an adjustment. And that's not what we are seeing today. And I don't see where the limit is for imbalances from that point of view.
So just to follow up on that, Jean, I don't know if you saw the chat, but I think John Clark also had a comment on the exchange rates. John, you want to come in with the question?
Yeah, sure. It was basically to say that there has been quite a lot of discussion about exchange rates and the China problem. In fact, and commentators are saying that essentially China has decided for the time being to keep the yuan cheap in order to promote exports, rather than let it revalue upwards, which would be a condition for the yuan to become competitive internationally against the dollar, which is a sort of long-term Chinese plan. So there has been a lot of discussion about this, but China has no intention, I think, for the time being, to allow its exchange rate to revalue upwards. What there's not been, and this is my question in the chat, any useful ideas about how in practice, if in practice, countries could actually do a kind of Plaza Accord 2.0 and negotiate changes to exchange rates between China, the USA, Europe, and other countries. Yeah, I mean, in the 2020s. I mean, is it possible in the current sort of globalized open economy to fix exchange rates, and what would be be the incentive for China to do that.
Yeah, you're right, John. Look, I'm not saying there were not discussions about exchange rates over the last years. What I'm saying is that I don't think there have been coordinated and significant pressure upon China for readjustment. Meaning that I make the difference between discussion by commentators and macroeconomic surveillance in terms of policy dialogue at the highest level.
That's true.
First point. Then secondly, how to deal with it, I fully agree, it's very difficult, okay? But still, there are low-hanging fruits. I mean, the PBOC is intervening on the market to prevent adjustment of its money through fixing. Okay, public institutions in China are accumulating a huge amount of reserves in foreign currency. So these are low-hanging fruit, and I don't think, to be blunt, I don't think that a wide-ranging agreement is feasible. But already moving towards in the right direction, using this kind of tools, which I think are here and ready to be used, that would already be a first step. Then I was referring to the bias in Chinese policy. I'm really very reluctant to say anything strong about Chinese policies because I think Chinese policymakers are very good, and for partners, the point is, to me, in my opinion, is really to emphasize that we don't want to bear the cost of their choices, and up to them to see how they do it, and they are extremely well skilled. So. And I recognize that it's very difficult, but it's clear, and it's a bit disturbing to see this reluctance to invest in social protection, for instance, in China. But again, that's a problem for Chinese policymakers.
Lou?
Yeah, thanks, Bernard, and many thanks to Sebastien for the presentation. I missed the early parts. I'm sorry for being late. Bernard knows that when we try to set up this session, and we try to invite some Chinese experts to come and talk, so we have a kind of dialogue, but we couldn't for various reasons. So it's a little bit pity that we don't hear Chinese voices. But of course, I mean, I'm Chinese. I go back to China and I do talk to them, Chinese experts, officials, about the things we discussed today. So maybe I will simply share a little bit what I hear in China. I mean, about these things, just try to help not pass a message, but share information which is missing from this session. And the sole purpose is, as I said, to enrich the discussion and nothing else. So on various points, so we don't have much time, so I just stick to a few key points, what I hear from them. I mean, the first one is whether the Chinese development quite phenomenon has been a result of its industrial policy or subsidies and so on and so forth. Chinese premier, I think just recently at the World Economic Forum, the summit Davos, a few weeks ago, and I think he said, I quote him, that our growth does not rely on subsidies, and we simply cannot afford them. And some Chinese experts say that the OECD, and mentioned by Sebastien, and also some other reports on this are not based on facts. Some, as said, some information are missing. So that's the first one. The second one, what I hear is from them is that we are not the one who invented industrial policy or subsidies, and we just learned them from the US, EU, which has been applied in the past decades, and so on and so forth. So I mean, what they say, the US and you also have domestic war to do. Your problem is not solely because of us, and you are also applying industrial policies or subsidies one way or the other on chips and others, automobiles. Number three, I think, which actually relates to what Sebastian, as one point in his concluding remark, which I personally very much agree, is that how to respond to that. So what I hear from China is that building high walls, be it tariff or anything else, will not solve the problem. And they also joke by saying that we Chinese are the best ones to build a wall, the Great Wall. It doesn't serve the purpose. And if anything like that comes up, we will respond. And that's what Chinese experts said. And then finally, what they say is that we can discuss these issues, industrial policies, subsidies, SOEs. And this is not only just recently said by Chinese Minister Wang Wentao. I think I have said at one or two FMG sessions is that as early as 2021, Chinese President Xi himself said that. And we can all discuss these things. But you have to come to a negotiating table, be it in the WTO, be it bilaterally, and so on and so forth. But recently, something they said which caught my attention is that a new Plaza Agreement done to Japan in 1985, Japan accepted, is the very wrong way to go. So don't even think about that. Negotiating is a way forward. So I'm just sharing this just to try to fill in a little bit gap here. And what I feel is very much that, as I said today over lunch to an expert in Geneva, is that what I feel a lot about China and about this global imbalance is a kind of what we quite often call a chicken and duck dialogue, which means that everybody is talking, but nobody is listening to each other. And the facts are not the same, so that the conclusions quite often are not the right way to go and probably lead to wrong answers. So again, as I said, I try to provide a little information on what I hear in China and try to share that and then to enrich the discussion. So I stop here. Thanks.
Thanks, Lou.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sebastian?
Yes, thanks a lot for this thoughtful comments. This is really extremely useful. And so I agree with most of what you've said. And in the last slide, in my last slide, I wrote, "We are on a collision course." And actually, I borrow that sentence from Chinese colleagues in a dialogue about these issues. Okay, so and I regret it, and they're saying that they were also regretting it, but assuming that it's better to name the situation than to face it than to ignore it. I know this. I heard about this speech by your prime minister saying we cannot afford it. Well, to be serious, I think it does not stand really. I mean, given China's level of development, of sophistication, of wealth, I think really that this argument is good if it was taken as a sense, I mean, as something good for the speech. But I think that there are a lot of very sound and serious and in-depth analysis showing that these subsidies are a reality. There are also analysis showing that public expenditure in China is currently mismeasured by official accounts, for instance, because they ignore debt finance resources and land transfer revenues. And if you take that into account, you conclude that at the end of the day, public expenditure in China is of the same order of magnitude than in OECD countries, except that we are spending 2/3 of that expenditure on social protection in OECD and only 1/3 in China. So the difference leave a whole lot of money to support selected industries. Now, it's true that China did not invent industrial policies, and it's actually a tribute to the skill and success of Chinese policymakers that we're having this kind of debates, because if they were a failure, there would be no real concern, actually. They've been extremely successful. I agree that tariff will not solve the problem. Now, I think in this debate, to be blunt, I fully agree. Tariff won't solve the debate, but we're also in a situation where China is applying extended export controls on key inputs. So it's difficult to pretend on one hand that everybody should play by the rules, and then on the other hand use these shock points as political levers. So I think it makes the situation here again politically unsustainable. You cannot, if you are a European policymaker, you cannot ignore this fact, and you cannot avoid supporting policies to limit those risks, even and give it a priority over international rule, over WTO rules, somehow. So, well, it's not just a way to emphasize that it's difficult to avoid the confrontational dimension of the situation, to avoid it completely. And on the Plaza Agreement, I know that that's really a terrible the thing to avoid when speaking to Chinese policymakers. I think it's largely an over and a bad interpretation of what happened to Japan. But anyway, as I said, I don't believe that that's the way to go. I don't believe it's any such agreement would be acceptable by China's leadership. So I think perhaps we have step-by-step approaches which would work more, provided we speak each other chicken to chicken, indeed, or duck to duck. I don't know. But,
Hamid.
Thank you, Sebastian, for excellent presentation and really enlightening and thought-provoking in many respects. As we're discussing, I've been thinking the China challenge or the China situation is obviously multifaceted, and therefore the solution to that challenge is not going to exist in one form. We would probably have to deal with the different aspects, different policy agendas that you referred to. But if I may focus a little bit on the trade side of the situation, I think the reality is that when China acceded to the WTO, acceded to the treaty system as it existed, which was not designed at all or equipped to handle a situation like the one we see with China today. The rules were not designed to address a situation like that. And of course, the China accession negotiations took place on the presumption that China was moving in a certain policy direction. And the conventional wisdom then was that that would be compatible with a rules-based system in which distortions are of certain types that were pre-identified, and we knew what was coming next. Of course, the reality is that, no, we didn't. Okay, we are where we are today. First of all, I think I agree with what you said completely, that this challenge cannot be faced through bilateral approaches. If there is going to be any kind of solution or part thereof, it will have to be systemic. And again, focusing on the trade side, the rules, obviously, that we have now need to be updated, need to be adjusted. And from a trade perspective, the objective of trade rules, as always, should continue to be dealing with the spillovers, not trying to change the economic system in order to avoid injury to trading partners and their respective industries. Now, what would that mean in terms of WTO approach to the situation, at least to deal with the trade side? I would see that there, and I would want to see what you think about this. I think there should be a vision about how the trade side of the China challenge should be addressed in WTO through updating of rules. And there may be two types of issues that might need to be addressed there. The first type is enhancing transparency obligations in order to make sure that WTO members know as much as possibly feasible with respect to China's practices. But then the other would be to upgrade trade remedies, a part of WTO rules, in order to equip trading partners with how to handle the spillovers from China's policies and avoid injury to their economies. And maybe one good place to start with that updating of rules is the safeguards disciplines. Because safeguards is the only trade remedy which is designed to address fair competition. As opposed to subsidies and anti-dumping. Now, that's what I see is possible within the WTO agenda framework going forward now. The other aspects that you referred to, which are terribly important and strategically paramount, I think need to be addressed. But in other fora, and if we try to mix everything together into one agenda, probably we'll keep going around in circles. So these are my thoughts, but thanks again, Sebastian. Back to you, Bernard.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Very useful. Perhaps I can give, well, you're asking deep questions. I'm not pretending I have good answers to that. Let me just perhaps make share one thought. One possibility, I fully agree with you that safeguards are especially interesting tools in the present situation. Why not consider, for instance, that in a situation where you have macroeconomic imbalances that you consider excessive in the sense that would need to be defined, then you might authorize increased flexibility in the use of safeguards. Okay, that might be a possibility to link together the macro and micro dimension somehow. And indeed, through this instrument, which is quite clearly interesting because it's not narrowly focused on a group of products as our anti-dumping or anti-subsidies investigations. I mean, it's short, but then very difficult to come up with something really decisive on redefining discipline of subsidies. And by the way, I'm generally try to completely avoid referring to overcapacities, which from my point of view is something I don't understand. I don't know what it is actually.
Okay, thanks, Sebastian. So we have 15 minutes left. I have two speakers. I don't know whether Wenha you wanted to come in or not, but if so, just raise your hand again. So Adam.
Yes, hello everyone. Thanks, Sebastian. It was a very, very insightful presentation. So my question is building on. I have two questions, but the one that I wanted to ask builds on the previous point. So you said there could be a way to enhance safeguards with some measure of what is excessive imbalances. So in this respect, how do you see the IMF assessments? So there is the IMF EBA model, which aims to kind of estimate because not all imbalances are bad, right? There is this component which is excessive if you take into account fundamentals like population aging, or even the optimal policies that should be there for fiscal. And then I also have a second question, which is more on the conceptual side of things. So that is, to what extent is this really a China-specific issue? So is China unique in this sense? Because we have seen, so I take the point that surpluses from the trade surpluses are maybe a more direct way to get at trade frictions than current account surpluses. But even if you look at trade surpluses, case in point, oil exporters, they have not benefited hugely in terms of technological advances. Also, some of the EU surplus economies now are in trouble with their competitiveness. So maybe there's something beyond this idea of simply the surplus driving it. And isn't the issue really about these non-market interventions rather than the surplus? So those are the two questions. Thank you.
Well, shortly, I think, the IMF analysis of excess imbalances, it's good, it's interesting. To me, it's not in the same order of magnitude as the imbalances we are observing in practice. Okay. And generally speaking, China is aging indeed. Actually, most of the world is aging. So the demographic structure is an important explanatory variable for Japan because it was so early on in that process. For China, it might only explain a fraction of what we're observing. So I don't think it really changes the orders of magnitude. Is that a China-only issue? No. What makes China remarkable, I think, are three things. Essentially, the first is size. The second is that those surpluses have been here for a long time, and in addition, they are increasing. And the third one, of course, are these non-market policies and practices. And that's the reason why I was emphasizing the importance of intent and causality in relation to policies. But not only, it's not China only, and even for the sake of international discussion, I think it's preferable to frame it generally. I mean, I want to name bluntly and more directly the questions, and it leads to single out China, but actually was referring to right now Taiwan or South Korea. There is a good case to be made that there is also a case of imbalance there.
Thanks. Gabrielle?
Thank you very much. I have a question. I'm probably the only non-economist, and I have a sort of legal perspective question. Tell me, Sébastien, whether you've heard about that. I understand that, from a WTO angle, one of the issue about public body and this question whether China provides subsidy, their answer traditionally has been, in China, the federal government does not provide the subsidy as such because of the way they organize their economic institutions. The money flows from entities other than the sort of federal government. So it's not, or it can be argued not to be a subsidy provided by the government. The OECD sort of created this concept of competitive neutrality a few years ago. And the EU sort of grabbed it and gave it the meaning of neutrality or equivalence between type of actions that provide benefit. And me as a lawyer, I always understood it as wanting to include the issue of forget who provides the money as such within the system, to the extent that an inflow of support is given, this is a subsidy. So the author, which is the critical legal question under WTO, the author of the donation is extremely important. If it's a company, it's not a subsidy. But as you know, in agriculture, Article 9 makes an exception and says subsidies given by sort of cooperative of farmers and all that will be considered as if it was a subsidy. My question to you is therefore, to your knowledge and the discussions with people, to what extent is it important or even mentioned, this legal argument that China feels that it's sort of outside the game of SCM because it's not the federal or the government that provides the money to enterprise, but maybe state trading, which themselves receive them from some sort of economic institution that is itself reporting to an upper body? Or is it just a question of economic balance issue? Or is this legal perspective, does it make
Yeah.
any sense to you as an economist? Have you heard about that? Because this is the way it was approached in the WTO.
Well, to as an economist, the question to me is, what are the spillovers? To what extent do Chinese policy costs paid, so to say, by their partners? That's the only thing that matters to me. And I think, by the way, that the low specificities we all know about subsidies or characterization of subsidies, and has been a big part of the misunderstanding of how to deal with subsidies in the WTO arena. So I think it's to me the constructive way to deal with that with our Chinese colleagues is really say, of course, your policies are your business. Our business is just to wonder about the consequences for us. And I think that's the way to go. Yeah.
I like very much what you just said, that for you as an economist, who gave the subsidy within the system is not really interesting. And the spillover is the effect. I can tell you that I attend a meeting with two or three quite high up Chinese talking, and their line was, if we want China to be able to protect the way it organize its internal economy, the best way would be for them to deal with subsidy from the end, the spillover effect, rather than what me as a lawyer would say the beginning, who gives the subsidy, because they have a different organization, and who gives the subsidy may not be sort of, like in the Occidental world 70 years ago or 50, 30 years ago when the SCM was created. But I'm glad to hear that for you as an economist, what counts is a spillover effect. Who provides the subsidy, whether it's general budget, small budget, canton budget, whatever, is not really relevant in your mind. I understand correctly? I can report you? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Of course, that does raise the little question of who actually is going to be in charge of determining what the spillovers are, how large they are, who bears the incidence. And this is, of course, something that is feed for economists, but then it's going to be a complicated thing to manage. Anyway, we have only 5 minutes left. So Stuart, last question, and then I'll pass it back to Sebastian.
Thanks very much, Bernard, and thanks to Sebastian, indeed to all of the people who've chipped in. It's been a fascinating discussion. I just thought I would make a brief comment because the subject of revising the safeguards agreement was raised, which is clearly a very worthwhile effort, and it would be an important part of the WTO reform effort, although the members seem to be approaching that in a rather desultory fashion at present. But nevertheless, that's really important. But it strikes me, particularly with the announcement that we had earlier this week from the EU, that they're going to set up this trade and investment consultative mechanism with China, following on from the US's announcement of a board of trade between the US and China. What we're looking at here is, as someone said earlier, managed trade. And so I think that's clearly in the short term, to me, that seems to be the direction that we're headed in, that the big players like the US and the EU will each be seeking their sort of level of comfort with China. And we'll have to see how that plays out. So although we're obviously in this group, we're strong supporters of WTO reform, and I'm certainly included in that, I think we have to recognize the reality that the reform effort may be kind of like a second stage that might follow on from a phase of managed trade. So that was just my take on the discussion. Thank you very much again to everybody.
Thank you. I agree. Somehow, my understanding is that it could also be viewed as many people or countries or leaders somehow giving up on a rules-based order and seeking an output-based order through this managed trade. Well, I guess we all are in hope that there is a possibility to update meaningfully the rules so as to open opportunities for something different. At the same time, I was emphasizing before the fact that if you are an EU policymaker, for instance, you cannot avoid thinking in terms of economic security given the present circumstances. So in any case, any meaningful update of the rules, I think will have to make more room for such objectives and constraints.
Okay, thanks for that. I think we're back to something that came up in the very beginning in terms of Sébastien advocating against blunt tariffs and using some kind of a mechanism, right, where you at least go through an exercise of figuring out, okay, what is the problem, what is causing the problem, quantifying, putting some numbers on that, and at least having a process that guides the effort. And I think that can, in principle, be done by the EU. Could be done unilaterally. That would already be better than blunt tariffs. I think even better is sitting around the table with China to discuss what the sources of the problems are. But again, ideally, of course, this should be done in a multilateral context and start thinking those things through. But I think that was really, for me, one of the key takeaways. Instead of pursuing the managed trade blunt tariff route, without really much in the way of an underlying analytical assessment of what we're trying to do, what the size of the problem is. If you don't do that, then very quickly we are going to be, it'll go beyond chickens talking to ducks. I think we'll have the chickens and the ducks getting kind of physical, which we don't want. Okay, let me end it there. I don't know if I'm supposed to end it or you end it, Mario, but...
No, Lou is back, so...
Okay, good. Lou can end it. You have 1 minute.
No, I can easily end this session. Thanks a lot. But it's difficult to end this dialogue because this is probably the very big subject that is hanging over the focus of our group, the WTO and its reform, because as we are discussing here, it's very much geopolitical, it's very much both macroeconomic and also systemic related vis-a-vis subsidies and others and all the disciplines we are trying to do here. So I think the only thing I can say is that we, of course, will continue this dialogue, and we are trying to discuss internally on how to put up a kind of both internal or public session like this to discuss in more detail about various issues raised here. But I very much agree with what Bernard said just now, is that the governments need to do their job because we are just experts trying to pass the information, analysis, and some humble recommendations. But the governments need to sit down together, of course, most helpfully in the WTO. But again, even in the WTO, it has to be a kind of ground dialogue, which will encompass many things: security, macroeconomic, currency, and others. Otherwise, I think if we continue to discuss like that, and it will just go on, and with no concrete solutions, and then, as Bernard said, that the chicken dialogue will get into physics. That's not what we want, and I don't think that's what the private sector or any other people want. So let's hope that things could be better in the months or years to come. So with that, thanks to Bernard very much for initiating this and also for moderating the session, and especially to Sebastian for really a very kind of comprehensive presentation. And thanks a lot. We continue like this, and see you next time. Thanks.
Thanks a lot
Okay,
for having
thanks.
me.
Thanks, Sebastian.
Thanks to all.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Excellent discussion. Bye.